Out here on the ranch, life is usually quiet. But when Karen, the HOA president, got a drone, quiet went right out the window. The first time I saw that drone, I was midair, banking my crop duster hard over the west pasture when a thing zipped past my windshield like a drunken mosquito on steroids. I nearly threw the stick sideways, fighting to level out before crashing into my own silo. As I caught my breath and wiped sweat from my brow, there was again, hovering like some mechanical vulture over my cattle, sending them scattering like a bag of spilled marbles. At first, I thought it was some kid messing around, but deep down, I already knew whose fingerprints were all over it. Only one person around here would be bold, nosy, and shameless enough to fly a spy drone over my ranch. Karen, head of the HOA, queen of the nosy neighbors. The very same Karen who had tried to find me last spring because my barn was painted what she called an unapproved shade of rustic red, as if there was a government-issued color chart for barns. Life out here was supposed to be simple. The sun, the soil, and the stock. That's all a rancher needs. For years, it was me, my cattle, and old man Rick next door who spent more time talking to his goats than people. But ever since Karen weaseled her way into the position of HOA president, things haven't been right. She never did care that my ranch technically sat outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Never mattered to her. She treated property lines like they were suggestions, not laws. And now, seeing her shiny new drone buzzing over my land like it owned the sky, I knew in my gut this was about more than some hobby. Later that day, I found Karen standing in front of my gate with that fake sweet smile plastered across her face. She was holding a clipboard, like she always did when she wanted to stir up trouble. Before I could even greet her, she chirped, "Saw some things from above today. Very concerning things." She said it like she was genuinely worried, but I could spot the satisfaction curling at the corners of her mouth. Karen was enjoying this. She was enjoying the power, real or imagined, that her little toy gave her. I asked her politely, through gritted teeth, what exactly she was referring to. She winked and said, "We'll be in touch," like she was the sheriff, the judge, and the executioner all rolled into one. Old man Rick came over that evening, carrying a six-pack of root beer and a grim expression. He'd seen the drone too, and, like me, had been around long enough to recognize when Karen was brewing a storm. We sat on the porch, watching the sunset, both of us silent until Rick finally grumbled, "Back in my day, we had a solution for pests. Shotguns and rock salt." I chuckled, but couldn't help noticing how serious he looked. Rick wasn't joking. Karen's drone wasn't just a nuisance. It was a warning shot. And considering Karen's habit of bending rules until they snapped, this wasn't going to be the last time that drone paid me a visit. The next morning, just as the sun peeked over the hills and the dew still clung to the grass, there was again. This time, hovering lower. The cattle spooked instantly, stampeding toward the fence line. I watched helplessly as one of my prized steers slammed into the corner post, splitting it clean in two. The fence sagged, and a few panicked heifers slipped right through, bolting toward the creek. Heart pounding, I grabbed my binoculars and zeroed in on the drone. It wasn't just watching the cattle this time. It was aimed squarely at my house, my workshop, even the backyard where my niece's old swing set still stood. Karen wasn't just playing around. She was casing my property like a burglar. By the time I rounded up the cattle and fixed the fence temporarily, Karen was already back, perched outside the ranch like a vulture waiting on roadkill. She greeted me with that syrupy voice again, but this time it dripped with something sharper. She handed me a folded letter, stamped with the HOA logo, and said, "We've had some complaints about the condition of your property. I'm afraid if this continues, we might have to consider alternatives for community use." My jaw nearly hit the dirt. Alternatives? Community use? She was talking about my ranch like it was an abandoned strip mall she could bulldoze for a parking lot. I stood there, dust covering my boots, sweat dripping from my hat brim, staring at the woman who was threatening to take everything I'd built. Karen smiled like she had already won. As she turned to leave, Rick appeared behind her, leaning on the fence post with a glint in his eye. Without missing a beat, he whispered to me, "Maybe it's time to dust off that old crop duster of yours." I didn't answer, not yet. But the idea, it stuck. As the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in orange and violet streaks, I stood in the middle of my ranch and stared at the horizon. This wasn't just about a drone or some HOA nonsense. Karen had just declared war on my land, my home, and my way of life. And if she wanted to fight, well, I've never been one to back down. Especially not when I've got a perfectly good crop duster sitting in the barn and a mischievous old neighbor more than willing to help. The war had begun, and the sky was about to get very interesting. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of propellers buzzing like a swarm of angry hornets. I didn't even have to look out the window to know what it was. Karen's drone was back, and this time, it had brought friends. Two smaller drones zipped alongside the main one, circling my fields like vultures sniffing for something dead. I stood on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching as they hovered over the cattle, swooped low near the barn, and even paused right above old man Rick's outhouse like they were trying to catch a mid-business. If it wasn't so downright irritating, it would have been funny. But it wasn't funny, not when those drones started chasing my cattle again, sending them into another panic. By noon, I had found 3 fences busted and several heifers tangled in barbed wire, bruised but lucky to be alive. Fixing fences is a daily part of ranch life, but repairing them because some busybody decided to play CIA? That was a whole new level of ridiculous. I could feel my patience wearing thin, like an old rope about to snap. I called the sheriff to file a formal complaint, but all he could do was sigh and tell me drones technically weren't illegal unless they were directly invading my home or causing physical damage. I mentioned the fences, but unless I caught footage of the drones causing the stampede, I had nothing but bad luck and a stubborn neighbor. The worst part? Karen knew it. Rick wandered over later that day, whittling a stick like he was carving out a strategy. He didn't say much at first, just grunted as he eyed the sky. Eventually, he gave me that sideways look of his and said, "You know, that crop duster's got more in it than chemicals." I raised an eyebrow, but before I could ask, he continued, "Them spray nozzles can be calibrated real fine, real accurate. Hell, I once knew a fella who knocked the hat clean off a scarecrow with just the mist." I didn't say it out loud, but a small smile curled at the corner of my mouth. Rick wasn't suggesting violence. He was suggesting creativity. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the buzzing in my head, imagining those drones circling like Karen was some kind of puppet master pulling strings from the other side of the fence. I found myself in the barn around midnight, running my hands over the crop duster like it was an old friend. The plane had been sitting for a while, but it wasn't beyond revival. With a little elbow grease and Rick's help, it could be airborne by sunrise. By dawn, we were tinkering under the hood like kids building a go-kart. Rick adjusted the spray nozzles while I dug through the shed for anything Karen wouldn't want soaking into her expensive electronics. We didn't want to cause permanent damage, just enough chaos to ground her little fleet. Rick came up with a mix that was equal parts water, molasses, and a secret ingredient he refused to name. Said it was a family recipe. All I knew was it was sticky, stinky, and guaranteed to clog up anything with a rotor. By mid-afternoon, the crop duster was humming like a songbird. Sure enough, as if on cue, Karen's drones were back, circling lower this time, like they were daring me to do something. I climbed into the cockpit, gave Rick a nod, and took off, kicking up dust behind me. The moment I cleared the treetops, the drones locked onto me like heat-seeking flies. I could see them bobbing and weaving in my rearview mirror, getting closer with each pass. I circled wide over the pasture, giving them room, and then, just as they started closing in, I flipped the switch. The spray erupted from the underbelly of the plane in a perfect arch, catching the lead drone squarely in its path. The molasses mixture hit it like a slap to the face, sending it spiraling out of control before crashing into a pile of hay bales near the east fence. The other 2 tried to dodge, but they weren't fast enough. A second blast caught them mid-turn, knocking one into the pond and the other into a patch of thistles, where it fizzled and sparked before going dead. By the time I landed, Rick was laughing so hard he nearly fell off the fence post. "Now that," he said between chuckles, "is what I call pest control." I couldn't help but join him, though I knew it wouldn't be the last of it. And sure enough, Karen showed up not 20 minutes later, red-faced and furious, carrying one of the sticky, broken drones like it was a wounded soldier. She accused me of sabotage, cruelty, and even violating airspace protocol, whatever that meant. I told her the truth. My crop duster was performing routine spraying, just like always. If her drones got caught in the crossfire, well, maybe they shouldn't have been trespassing. Karen wasn't buying it. She stormed off, muttering about lawsuits and regulations. But the real show came when she returned with the sheriff. To his credit, the sheriff stayed professional, but I could see the amusement in his eyes. He took one look at the drone, sniffed the molasses still dripping from its frame, and asked Karen if she had registered her aircraft. She hadn't. Turns out, there were rules about drones flying over private property, and Karen had ignored all of them. Still, the sheriff said technically no laws had been broken on my end. My spraying was perfectly legal. Karen tried to cry right there in the driveway, sobbing about how unfair it all was, how she was just trying to protect the neighborhood. But her crocodile tears didn't work this time. The sheriff tipped his hat to me, told her to let it go, and drove off, leaving Karen standing there, sticky drone in hand, absolutely humiliated. As Rick and I watched from the porch, he said, I don't think we've seen the last of her." I knew he was right. Karen wasn't the type to give up after one setback. If anything, I figured I'd just given her a reason to double down. But standing there, watching the sunset and listening to the frogs singing by the creek, I realized something important. She might have drones, clipboards, and the entire HOA behind her, but I had the sky, a crop duster, and Rick. And together, we were just getting started. I should have known Karen wouldn't take the drone fiasco lying down. By the time the weekend rolled around, the air was thick with trouble, and not just from the humidity. Rick spotted them first, just past midnight, a convoy of HOA folks sneaking onto my land like raccoons after the chicken feed. Flashlights bobbed between the fence posts, and in their arms were rolls of laminated signs and stakes. We watched from the shadows, neither of us saying a word, as they hammered the first sign right into the entrance of my pasture. When they left, thinking they were unseen, Rick and I walked over and read the bold, arrogant letters. Notice of seizure. Property TO be reclaimed by the Homeowners Association of Whispering Pines Community. The gall of it nearly knocked the breath out of me. By morning, they had plastered them everywhere. The front gate, the barn doors, even my mailbox, as if the ranch was some condemned building waiting for demolition. I stood there in disbelief, holding one of the laminated signs in my hand, while Karen strutted down the road with a grin like the cat who swallowed the canary. She waved sweetly, as if we were old friends, then had the audacity to blow me a kiss. My blood boiled hotter than the August sun. She had crossed a line, and the worst part was she knew the sheriff couldn't do much without proof that Karen herself had authorized the act. The HOA might have been complicit, but Karen was too smart to leave her fingerprints. At least, so she thought. Later that day, Rick showed up with the latest issue of the HOA's self-published newsletter folded under his arm like he was carrying state secrets. "You want to see this?" he said, sliding it across my kitchen table. Right there, in full color, was a smug article about the HOA's efforts to improve the community's future by repurposing land for public good. Alongside it were photos taken directly from the drone's footage. But they hadn't been careful. In one of the smaller photos, there was Karen, plain as day, standing next to the drone controller with a group of HOA members, pointing at a map of my ranch with markers and lines drawn all over it like a football playbook. It wasn't just surveillance. It was a blueprint for theft. I could have marched straight to the sheriff then and there, but something about the injustice made me pause. If I moved too quickly, Karen would wiggle out of it like she always did. No, this needed to be bigger, public, unmistakable, the kind of embarrassment she couldn't hide behind legalese or crocodile tears. Rick, who had been pacing like a cage dog, stopped suddenly and grinned. "You still got those barrels of marking dye in the shed?" I hadn't thought about those in years, but yes, tucked behind old tools and broken fence rails were 3 full barrels of brightly colored, environmentally safe dye we used back when we were marking fields for aerial surveys. By sundown, Rick and I were elbow deep in the shed, mixing the dye with another batch of his sticky secret sauce, making sure it was just the right consistency to not only coat surfaces but stay there for days. We patched up the crop duster, triple-checked the sprayers, and waited. Karen was planning a big HOA block party that weekend, supposedly to celebrate new community initiatives. What she was really doing was hosting a victory parade for herself, banking on no one realizing that she was about to illegally claim someone else's land as a community garden. Word about the party spread fast. Even folks who didn't usually care for HOA drama were curious. By Friday night, tents, folding chairs, and cheap string lights littered the field just beyond my fence. Karen had gone all out. There were banners declaring a new future for Whispering Pines, tables stacked with flyers, and even a podium for speeches. Karen was working the crowd like a politician, grinning and shaking hands, pretending this land was already hers. Rick and I kept low, watching from the ridge above the field. He chewed on a toothpick like it was a cigar, and I could tell he was enjoying this more than he probably should. But I wasn't about to stop him. I watched Karen bask in the applause, soaking up attention, oblivious to the fact that her whole scheme was about to backfire spectacularly. The sheriff was there too, sipping coffee by the parking lot, giving me the occasional knowing glance. He hadn't been able to act on the drone footage alone, but he was more than happy to let me handle this my way. As the sun dipped low and the string lights flickered on, I climbed into the crop duster one last time. Rick gave me a thumbs up from the ground, and with the engine roaring to life, I took off into the evening sky. The party-goers barely noticed at first, assuming it was just some harmless flyover. Karen even waved at the plane, smug as ever. That smugness vanished the second the first streak of dye hit the ground. The spray lit up the field like a crime scene under a black light. The dye revealed every single illegal stake, hidden boundary marker, and tampered fence line Karen's crew had secretly planted. The bright colors outlined a web of deception no one could ignore. The words "property of Whispering Pines, HOA." Karen had tried to stencil into my land, stood out in blinding fluorescent green, unmistakably marking her intent to steal it. Gasps rose from the crowd. Phones came out. Photos were snapped. It wasn't just hearsay now. It was evidence in high definition and living color. Karen's face went from smug to horrified in seconds. She stumbled back from the podium as neighbors swarmed the marked areas, seeing for themselves how deep the scheme went. The sheriff stepped forward, arms crossed, as Karen stammered and tried to blame overzealous committee members, but it was too late. The whole town had seen it. The HOA members who had been in on it tried to scatter like cockroaches under a kitchen light, but the damage was done. As I circled back toward the barn, I could hear the crowd erupt, some cheering, others shouting questions at Karen, who looked like she was about to melt into the dirt. Rick was already waiting when I landed, grinning so wide it looked like his face might split in two. "Reckon she'll have a hard time explaining this one," he said. I didn't answer. I just watched as the sunset behind the hills painted the sky orange and purple. The same colors now splattered across every corner of my land, spelling out one simple truth. Karen's game was over, and she didn't even see it coming. The aftermath of the spray down was nothing short of glorious chaos. By sunrise, word had already spread beyond Whispering Pines. Videos flooded social media of Karen standing in the middle of the glowing neon disaster, desperately flapping her arms and shouting at anyone who would listen. Neighbors, even the ones who usually kept their noses out of ranch business, had questions, and they weren't the friendly kind. Some accused her directly. Others filmed her meltdown for posterity, and a few even helped themselves to the free HOA refreshments while they waited to see if the sheriff would slap handcuffs on her right then and there. Karen, red-faced and shaking, tried everything from blaming her committee to claiming the dye was part of a planned art installation, but no one was buying it. The sheriff showed up early, coffee in hand, calm as ever. He strolled past the rattled crowd and stopped right in front of Karen as if they were discussing the weather. She tried her usual trick, layering charm and excuses like frosting on a bad cake, but the sheriff didn't budge. He pulled out the HOA newsletter that Rick had given me, flipping it open to the very page showing Karen and her merry band of conspirators standing around the drone and the marked map. It was all there, plain as day, and no amount of crying or sweet-talking was going to make it disappear. The moment Karen realized she'd been caught by her own vanity was better than any victory I could have imagined. The sheriff calmly informed her that while he wasn't dragging anyone off in cuffs just yet, there was more than enough evidence to open a formal investigation into trespassing, attempted land fraud, vandalism, and harassment. Karen's eyes darted from neighbor to neighbor, realizing that every witness she needed to spin this story had just watched it unfold live. There was no backpedaling, no spinning, and no fake tears that could erase those bright spray marks still glowing in the morning light. Later that day, the sheriff made it official. The HOA was under investigation. Karen was removed as president, temporarily, though everyone knew it was permanent. Even her closest allies turned tail, pretending they had no idea what she was up to, leaving her stranded like a skunk at a garden party. Rick and I watched from the ridge as the HOA tore down the last of their makeshift signs, avoiding eye contact with anyone who passed by. Some tried to play innocent, but most just looked embarrassed, shuffling away like kids caught cheating on a school test. But Karen wasn't one to slink off quietly. A few days later, she showed up at the edge of the ranch, standing there like a ghost from a bad memory. She didn't have her clipboard or her usual smug expression, just a desperate twitch in her eye and a rolled-up newspaper in hand. Turns out, the newsletter's drone footage didn't just show her illegal plans. It also accidentally recorded audio. Crystal clear audio. And Rick, being the old rascal he is, had already pulled the drone's SD card when no one was looking. He handed it over to the sheriff right after the party, making sure Karen never got the chance to lose the footage. But here's the real kicker. The footage caught Karen rehearsing her fake crying scene for social media, complete with practice sobs and even a comment about how gullible people are. Rick couldn't contain his laughter when we played it back. Neither could the sheriff. The clip went viral overnight, spreading like wildfire across town forums and neighborhood groups. The HOA's reputation crumbled faster than an old fence in a windstorm. By the end of the week, Karen was the punchline of every joke from the coffee shop to the feed store. Despite all that, she still had the nerve to show up and try one last Hail Mary. She offered me a deal. If I promised not to press charges, she'd step down quietly and leave the ranch alone. I leaned against the fence and let her ramble, watching the desperation settle into her eyes. For the first time, she wasn't playing queen of the neighborhood. She was just someone who'd been caught. After everything she'd put me through, I should have told her to take a hike. But standing there, with Rick watching from the porch and the sheriff parked up the road, I realized I didn't need to say much at all. I told her the truth. It wasn't about pressing charges or winning some petty feud. It was about her finally understanding that this wasn't just land to me. It was home. It was my family's legacy, sweat and hard work baked into every inch of soil. And she was never going to take it away with some drone and a few fake signs. She left without another word, head down, feet dragging, and I swear I could hear Rick chuckling all the way from the porch. The sheriff officially closed the case 2 weeks later. Karen was stripped of all HOA authority and barred from ever holding a position again. The new HOA president, a younger fellow named Mike who actually cared about the community instead of power, came by with a pie and an apology. He promised no one would ever mess with my ranch again. I didn't trust him entirely yet, but the pie was good, and that was a start. Life slowly returned to normal. The cattle calmed down, the fences were repaired, and the skies stayed clear of buzzing drones. Rick still couldn't go a day without bringing up the aerial spray down. He even joked about painting a little drone silhouette on the crop duster, like an old warplane marking a confirmed kill. We laughed about it, but deep down I knew I'd do it again if I had to. Not because I enjoyed the fight, but because some things are worth standing up for. A few months later, someone sent me a link. Karen had gone viral, all right, but not in the way she wanted. The footage of her rehearsal, complete with her practicing a trembling lip and crocodile tears, had made its way onto a popular rancher meme page. The caption read, HOA Queen learns to cry, fails miserably. Millions of views, thousands of comments, and no sign of slowing down. Rick and I watched it together on the porch, sipping cold root beers as the sun sank low over the pastures. Rick nudged me with his elbow and said, You reckon she'll ever show her face around here again? I just grinned, tipped my hat back, and said, not unless you want another round of aerial art. We sat there in comfortable silence, listening to the breeze rustle the tall grass, knowing full well that Karen's reign was over and the ranch was safe, once and for all. The sky was ours again, and that's exactly how it was going to stay.